Hey, welcome back everybody. It's BI 101. We are on, I think, class 6, and that's biodiversity and ecosystem services. So let's get started. All right. So I asked this question at the very beginning of the class. So what? Why save biodiversity? People like me really care about biodiversity, but um, some people don't necessarily. So I like to ask this question: so what? What are the motivations why everybody, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other scientists, why should everybody care about biodiversity? We are going to answer that pretty carefully here today. Okay, so what I want to do is bring you back up to speed on ecosystem services. We talked about that in class 1. This is a good review for what comes up next in this video lecture, because we're going to talk about ecosystem services a lot. All right, now I want to go back to the beginning where I showed you this uh, chart from the Stockholm Resilience Center. The 9 categories on this chart represent the 9 planetary systems that humanity and humanity relies on for survival. And it's everything from freshwater use to climate to ocean chemistry, etc. Okay, and the length of these bars represents like how far we are within or outside of the safe zone of managing the planet. So the safe zone represents this dotted circle, this heavy dotted circle in the center here. And for something like stratospheric ozone depletion, we're okay. We're below that dark dotted line. But if you take it something like climate change, we are already past that line of safe operation and getting ever closer to up here where we get into a high risk zone. For other categories like biodiversity, that's this wedge right here we're going to be talking about today, we are and have been for quite some time well past this boundary here, which is the zone of safe operation. We're also past that boundary when it comes down here to the amount of nutrients we put into the environment. We talked about fertilizers, nitrogen, and phosphorus. That's what that's all about, okay? So all this to frame the importance of biology to our survival, the importance of biodiversity, I should say, to our survival. That's this wedge right here. Okay, now I also introduced early on in the class this concept of ecosystem services. Sometimes you see it as ecological services, okay? Ecosystem services are the things that ecosystems provide to us for free. And there are 4 categories. You see them at the center of this chart. There's provisioning, cultural, supporting, and regulating, okay? So without these services, life on the planet for humans, it's over. We are completely dependent on these for survival. I brought up in the very first class a couple examples of that. One of them was pollinators. These are insects that wind up pollinating flowers and plants. And we wind up having, let me turn the volume down. Sorry, I got family text storming me for some reason. Sorry about that. So pollinators wind up pollinating the crops, 75% of the world's crops, the plants that we rely on for our food. Things like corn are wind pollinated corn and other grasses like rice and wheat and so forth, but most everything else, fruits and many vegetables, are pollinated by insects. Those insects come from natural areas, and those wind up coming from natural ecosystems and helping us pollinate our crops. Another example is up at the top right here. That's medicines. Most of the most important medicines that we humans use, and some of us are alive because of them, they come from nature. The original molecules are found in nature. Sometimes we still extract them from nature, and sometimes we now manufacture them in the lab. But either way, nature was the inspiration for that. Okay, so these are some examples of some really critical ecosystem services. Pollination is a regulating service, as you see here, and and medicines are a type of provisioning service. We'll explain that in more detail in a moment. Okay, now here's the connection between ecosystem services and biodiversity. Ecosystems provide more services and better quality services when their native species are present and their populations are healthy. In other words, that's why we need biodiversity. It helps keep these ecosystem services working for us. I illustrated in the very first class this food web. This is a marine food web showing you lots of different species and how they interact through their feeding relationships. Each of these lines means that there's a dependency of one organism feeding on another. Some species are in the middle, meaning that they are both predators and prey. Those are the ones that are in the middle. Some are at the bottom, some are at the top predators, right? Okay, now imagine you take one of these groups of organisms out of here, one of these species out of here, and think about all the relationships between the other groups that it's connected to, how those relationships will be gone. Causes a severe disruption to the ecosystem. That means that the ecosystem services that are provided are going to be less. So in here, for example, you could find salmon, like up here. These are different species of salmon at the top left. Some of their principal prey include herring. You lose one of these types of herring, and you're going to lose a major food base for salmon. You lose the food base for salmon, and you wind up losing a lot of the fishes that are commercially important to the U.S. Fish industry, and also really important to indigenous societies on the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast. Okay, let's move on. All right, so this week, it's September, it's the second week in September 2020. Professors from around the U.S. and around the world are going on quote-unquote strike to show solidarity with the social justice movements that are ongoing right now, particularly issues that we've seen around Black Lives Matter and so forth. I'm not going to go on strike and cancel class because I feel like that does too much harm to the learning that you guys need. However, what I've done is I've selected an article and some topics for us to talk about in class that tie together systemic racism with ecosystem services that we're going to be talking about. So what I want you to do is pause the video in a moment and go to Moodle and click on the link for reading this article right here. This article is about a science article that came out less than a month ago, I think August 13th. So that's not even a month ago. And the article links issues of equity and equality in urban environments and how that's tied to the environmental health of those communities, how it's tied to the ecosystems, and even evolutionary processes in those communities. It's a pretty heady article. We're reading the whole thing for one of my upper level courses, but this is a nice summary of some of the key points in that article. So I want you to read that article. It won't take you too long. It's a few minutes to read, but I want you to be able to answer these 3 questions, and we will have some conversation on these topics during our class on Wednesday. So be able to answer these 3 questions, and you can find a link to the article on Moodle, or if you've downloaded these PowerPoint slides, you can use that link right there. By the way, I've also uploaded the original science article by the scientists. It is full of detail, and it's really provocative, really mind-blowing. And if you are curious, especially those of you that are in the social sciences and want to, or anybody who wants to learn more about how majority and wealthy communities have things a lot better in their cities than minority and poorer communities, and the context here is environmental issues, then I'd encourage you to download that paper and skim through it and pull out some of the key points. You don't have to do that though for this exercise though. You can go online and find some more things about like how to answer some of these questions, like explaining the question number 2, explain some of the causes for these disparities based on the article and other readings you find online. For example, one of the ones mentioned in the article is redlining. If you don't know what redlining is, make sure by the time you're done studying for this class, you understand what redlining is and why it has lasting impacts on communities across the U.S. Okay, so go ahead and pause and read that article, find your answers to these questions, and then come on back to the video lecture. Okay, welcome back. I want to talk about the two different forms of valuing biodiversity. One is intrinsic value and the other is instrumental value. Now, intrinsic value has nothing to do with ecosystem services. It is all about the value that something has in and of itself. It's the value that I think each of you has. You do not have to be valuable to me in order for you to have your own value. That's an example of intrinsic value. You carry that with you wherever you go. And so instrumental value in contrast means that the value has to have something of value to another entity. And we'll get into those examples in just a minute. So intrinsic value is important because a lot of people are motivated to protect biodiversity because they think that other species have the right to survive on this planet. It's their home too, after all, and that it is unfair to cause their extinction. That doesn't mean that we can't, sometimes hunt them or eat them or or domesticate them, that sort of thing. It's not what that is saying. It's just saying that we should not be causing their complete eradication. Okay, that's intrinsic value, or at least a generic kind of a explanation of intrinsic value. All right, so the illustration at the bottom is just to illustrate that intrinsic value is not about ecosystem services, but we're not going to talk too much more about intrinsic value today. Okay. All right, so now let's turn our attention to exploring ecosystem services in more detail. And I think a lot of these slides say ecological services, ecosystem services. You can use them interchangeably. I think most folks use ecosystem services. Okay. So what I want to do now is go into each of these four types of ecosystem services and show you some examples to make sure you have a good solid understanding of that. All right. Now, the very first one I want to start off with is the supporting services. Think of supporting services as all the background stuff that ecosystems do in order for humans as well as other species to survive. For example, microbes in the soil do nutrient cycling so that leaf matter from trees is broken down and those nutrients are liberated to be taken up by other plants to continue the cycle. The process of breaking down rock and turning it into soil formation, the process of photosynthesis. All of these are background things that are really important to simply keeping life alive on the planet. That's why they're called supporting services. Okay? So I'm not going to spend too much more time on supporting services. I think a lot of them are self-evident by now, and you understand what they are. We'll spend a little bit more time looking at the other types of ecosystem services. And of those, let's turn now to regulatory services. These are the ecosystem processes that moderate natural phenomenon. For example, if you look at the bottom, you will see a wooded area next to a river that has been flooded. That's a floodplain that is capturing floodwater and keeping that floodwater from going downstream. That's a good thing. That's a service for us because that floodplain is keeping houses and cities and farmland from being flooded downstream. So what we need to have along our rivers is more floodplain that has been restored with forest, as you see on the left, and less of people building homes in floodplains like you see on the lower right. That's a huge problem we have in the U.S. and in other parts of the world, and climate change is making it worse. So floodplains are providing those flood control. So wetlands and floodplains are providing that flood control. Some of the other types of regulatory services on here are listed. We talked about pollination before. Seed dispersal is when animals move the seeds from plants out through the landscape. That helps keep forests growing and spreading and keeps the landscape healthy in terms of its plant biodiversity. Preventing soil erosion, roots of plants do that sort of thing. Okay, I think you get the idea. So they're regulating these processes in the environment. Remember, processes are things that are happening, like cycles they're constantly in motion. They're not just something you can remove, like a product. We're gonna see that next. Okay. All right. So the third, or actually, I think we're on our final. No. This is our third, sorry, I got confused. Our third ecosystem service is provisioning services. And these are the types of things that we extract from nature, that we go out in nature, we find it, we take it, okay? And there are 4 categories. I'm going to go through each of these. This last bullet point here is kind of messed up. You can ignore that. I should say that there's the 3 types that we're going to look at here: goods, information, and psychospiritual. All right. Types of provisioning services. Let's start with goods. So goods are things that we actually extract and use directly. So food. So for example, many people in the world, I think it's over 2 billion people on the planet, actually go out into the wild and extract food from the wild each day. Most of that is along the coasts, and of course that would be fishing. So that's one example of provisioning services. It's also worth noting that nature has lots of other things out there that might be potential foods for us, whether it's crops, mostly crops, but also potentially some animals. Those would also be examples of food, even though they're not yet in widespread use necessarily. Okay. Another example of a good, something we go out and extract from nature, would be like fuel wood for cooking fires, or charcoal. You take fuel wood and convert it into charcoal, for example. These are examples of fuel taken from nature and then used in order for us to cook or to heat our homes and these sorts of things. Much of the world does not cook on a cook stove. They are cooking over an open fire. So it's important to keep that in mind, that how important forests are and the availability of fuel wood is to those people, simply to cook their food. There's other types of categories here. Some of them might seem more abstract, but if you realize that we've extracted things from nature, it fits, right? So zoos, where did the animals come from? They came from nature. Botanical gardens, where did the plants come from? They came from nature, etc. Even our precious pets, like my daughter's cat. Originally, that cat came from nature as a wild species that was domesticated, for example. Okay, all of these are examples of goods. Now, medicinal value, medicines, that's another example of a good. And I want to tell you the story here of the rosy periwinkle. This is a textbook example, literally a textbook example of the value of biodiversity. The pharmaceutical companies of the world often send their scientists out into nature to find different plants and sometimes animals that might have complex chemicals in them that could be used as drugs. Everything from anti-malarials to anti-cancer drugs and these sorts of things. Okay, so this would clearly be a good as a form of provisioning service. Well, there's some of the stats here to back this up is that the top 20 selling drugs, not just top 10, but top 20, are all natural products or molecules that we have found in nature, and then we slightly modify them and then manufacture them in the lab. So most of us have taken these products in our lives multiple times. Some of you might be taking them on a daily basis, and a few of us in the class are probably alive because of these drugs. And they're used, again, like I said, for cancer, malaria, AIDS, etc. Lots and lots of species out there have never been looked at in terms of their drug potential. So as you know, this is plenty of reason to keep the forests and the oceans of the world around and full of organisms, because it's our living pharmacy that is out there on the planet. We also need to keep in mind that a lot of people still get their medicines. They don't go to the corner Walgreens or CVS. They go out to the forest. They know what plants to use for certain ailments, everything from intestinal problems to skin problems, etc. There's some deep wisdom in the indigenous societies of the world that live in close contact with nature. And a lot of times the pharmaceutical companies are learning from these indigenous societies about what plants they use, and then that leads to new drugs for the developed world. Now, here's the rosy periwinkle story. That plant that you see pictured there on your screen is the rosy periwinkle. Some biological prospectors had gathered these plant samples in Africa and had taken them back to the lab. The other scientists tested them and discovered that they that the chemical in it was really good at combating childhood leukemia, which had a 95% death rate. That means like out of 20 kids with leukemia, 19 of them are going to die. Well, they said, hey, this is good plant, but we need more of these plants so that we can study these molecules. We're going to have to extract more of the molecules from the plants so that we can study them and manufacture them on our own. So they go back to Africa, and the place where they found the plant was completely gone. The forests had all been converted into farmland and pasture. And this is very typical around the world in our tropical forests, unfortunately. However, after some diligent searching, after several weeks, they eventually found another place where this plant was found, brought some plant samples back this time and started propagating them in captivity, and wound up the company wound up making a drug that now reduces the childhood death rate of leukemia down to 5%. So from 19 kids out of 20 dying, it's 1 out of 20 dying, thanks to finding the drug in nature. This sort of thing happens all the time. This is plenty of good reason for us to keep nature around. Okay, a little bit more of an abstract way of thinking about provisioning services is information. We derive information from nature all the time. One example of that is the genetic information that we're using to engineer crops that can survive drought and survive other climate extremes. Most of us here in the U.S. are eating what are called GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Some cultures of the world are really against GMOs. The Europeans, for example, are really against GMOs. Americans just kind of shrug it off. What's right and wrong sort of lies in between, but mostly on the side of science, which is that most GMOs are not a problem for human health or environmental health. That said, we need to use them carefully. However, GMOs are going to be, from what I understand from all the reading I've done, GMOs are going to have to be essential to providing enough food for all the people this century and beyond. And so when we find a gene in one species that we can extract and put in another species to increase its nutritional value or to increase its drought tolerance, that's good for agriculture, that's good for people. And so that's an example of information, treating the genetics or the genes that are extracted and used for this as information. Okay, a second example of information would be biomimicry. That's when people use examples of things in nature to inspire how to do things better with our own tools and stuff. And so there's lots of examples of this. For example, the wing of an airplane and the wings in the shape of jets and so forth. A lot of the first aerospace engineers were looking at birds and trying to figure out, how do birds do this? How do they fly? What is the shape of their wing? And that led to the discovery of the airfoil, which is what our aircraft use to as part of flight. So that's an example of biomimicry, and there's hundreds of more examples that are out there. And finally, we use other species as environmental indicators that tell us about the health of the ecosystem, the health of the environment that sometimes we're living in right there next to those species. And when we see them suffering and not doing well, that's a good sign that we need to check things out. Maybe there's a problem with our water, the soil, the air, something along those lines. Species are out there in the ecosystem 24/7, 365, so they're really good sentinels for what could be happening in the ecosystem that might be a problem. So all of these are examples of information as one of the types of provisioning services. All right, now we're going to switch to our last type of ecosystem service, and that is cultural services. These are things that are not necessarily essential to our survival, but enrich our lives, enrich our cultures of the world. So it's everything from recreation. You see some people paddling on a big river, having a lot of fun. Can't do that when the river's not there. Can't do that when the river's polluted and it's not safe to get in, for example. You see some people at the bottom left doing some bird watching. a lot of people go out to nature to watch nature, whether it's birds, butterflies, or just simply to walk around a lake or walk through a forest, that sort of thing. And then a picture down to the right to sort of illustrate art. Pause this video for a second. Just do it. Just give this a try. Pause the video lecture and then look around your environment. I'm assuming you're in like your dorm room or your apartment or something like that. And I bet you're going to find examples of nature all around you where we've used nature to design things. I usually do this in the classroom and sort of walk around and find things, but I bet you're going to be able to find some things. So go ahead and pause and do that just quickly. See what you find. Okay, so hopefully you found a few examples of that around you, and certainly if you keep your eyes open, you'll see lots of examples of us using nature to sort of decorate our world and as inspiration for art in many forms. It's not just the visual arts, it's performance arts as well. Okay. All right, now another type of cultural service is what's called psycho-spiritual value. So we're getting into some terrain here that's a lot less tangible, but really important to who and what we are. So psycho-spiritual value is the value that biodiversity provides that benefits your psychological well-being, or the value that biodiversity has based on your spiritual worldview. And let me point out that just because I love nature doesn't mean I love all nature. There's a mosquito biting my forearm. Oh, I wasn't fast enough. He got away. So, but the point is that that we need to. While it's important that mosquitoes exist, we don't want them to go extinct. It's okay to swat mosquitoes. More than okay. Some of these mosquitoes are exotics that are disease transmitters and stuff too. All right, so back on track here for cultural services. Psycho-spiritual services are all about our well-being, our psychological well-being, and often are part of our spiritual worldview, for those of you that have a spiritual component to your worldview. So let's take a look at some different reasons how and why we have psycho-spiritual values. One of them is biophilia. This is a term that's been developed to explain why humans prefer environments that have more species in them than fewer species in them. So, for example, if you were to ask people, would you like to have, like in your dorm room, like 5 potted plants of the same species, or 5 potted plants in each from a different species? On average, most people would be like, yeah, I want one of each of the different kinds. This has been found for the way people like to decorate their immediate surroundings where they live, but also the types of landscapes that they feel most comfortable in and enjoy visiting when they have time off and these sorts of things. So that's called biophilia. We prefer to live in environments where we're surrounded by more diverse species than environments where there's not much going on in terms of species diversity. Okay, and that's for several reasons. It's also using, sorry, I got a little distracted there. Another example of psycho-spiritual value is having a place for retreat and reflection. Yesterday, I found a patch of woods near where I live, and it was the first time I found this patch of woods, and it was the first time in my neighborhood, I could get away from like streets and cars and buildings and things like that. And I just went out in the woods and I just sat there and just sort of soaked it in for a few minutes. And for me, that was really rejuvenating. That's the kind of thing that people use nature for all the time, whether they're doing it consciously or not. And so that's an example of psycho-spiritual value. And then some people see nature as a place for spiritual inspiration. There's lots of examples from the great religions of the world of prophets and otherwise folks going out into nature and finding inspiration. It's not just spiritual leaders, but it's also like philosophers and so forth. We have some deep connections with nature when it helps us sort of, as when we're contemplating big questions about the meaning of our lives and so forth. Okay, and then nature is artistic inspiration. We'd already talked about that. Nature as art. Okay, I'm gonna blast past that. Okay. For some, the argument for biodiversity preservation is a moral one, meaning it's about issues of right and wrong. For example, some people see that that species should be considered as masterpieces, meaning that they are, as products of evolution that has gone on for millions of years, species are too old and too complex to be discarded because they're inconveniently in the way of human progress. And that they would say that destroying biodiversity is like destroying a church or a museum that has a tremendous value to us, especially like old museums and old churches with things that you can't find anywhere else, because species are unique. You can't find, once it's gone, it's completely gone forever. There'll never be another species quite like it. Okay, so that's just one way of explaining moral reasons for protecting species. Another way that some people have taken is to look at the genetic unity of life on the planet. So all species on the planet, every one of them, however many billions of them there are, we all share commonalities in our DNA. And evolution, as we're going to get to in a few weeks, the more we understand about evolution, the more it's very clear that life arose on the planet in one event, maybe a couple of events like early on, and everything else has derived from that. So essentially, just as you have family members that are related to you and you share DNA with them, the same is true for humans and other species on the planet, that we are all part of the same family, united genetically. So that mosquito I took a swat at, yeah, that's the very distant cousin that I don't get along with very well. Still part of the family. All right, and then a third category here is stewardship. A lot of the religions of the world, including the Christian tradition, we'll talk about in a minute, the teachings say that we should protect other species. Another way of putting this, from a more philosophical, more broadly, less religiously, but more broadly spiritual perspective, is to say that we should protect our only known living companions in the universe. We've never just found life anywhere else. We may not ever, given how big and deep space is. So all these other species around us, these are our neighbors, and it would be really lonely without them. So even those mosquitoes. So that's the stewardship argument for that, and all three of these are morality-based arguments. Okay. In the Christian tradition, and this is also, there's similar lines of thinking in other of the world's religions, but in the Christian tradition, recently there's been a movement called the Stewardship of Creation movement, which is based on some of the opening lines in Genesis about seeing that the world is created for man, and of course for humans, I would say, and that that we are to be good stewards of creation. And so there have been many religious leaders that have said that we need to do a much better job of protecting the environment, simply for those reasons. There's lots of practical reasons as well, but a lot of folks, it helps them to be inspired by their religions to do the right thing for nature. Okay, moving on here. So there are other ways of looking at psychospiritual valuation, and researchers have come up with some clever ways of measuring psychospiritual valuation. And one way to do that is to ask people the question and measure their responses about like how they would feel if they were to learn that a species had gone extinct. And we're going to do that right now. Ordinarily, I would do this in a class, and we would click in with some technology what our responses are. Since we're doing this class virtually, instead, what I'm going to show you are some of the results from a past class, a recent class, where I recorded the results as students responded. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of pictures of species and tell you a little bit about them, and then ask you how you would feel if you were to hear the news that species had gone extinct. And just to be clear, extinction means the species is gone forever. It's not the last one on the planet has died. It's not in captivity. It's nowhere. It's not coming back. Okay, so extinction being forever. Okay, write down your answers, and then we'll compare them to the stats for a whole class at the end. All right. So this clam here is the Coosa moccasin shell. It's a type of mussel. It's currently endangered from human activities. It's only found in 2 rivers in the world, right here in Alabama, the Coosa River and the Cahaba River. If you were to find out the species was extinct, would you feel at least a little sense of disappointment or loss or sadness? Go ahead and record your answer. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to, like a moment or two to think about your answer. Okay, moving on. Here's another species. This is a vermilion darter. It's a small fish that's found in only one creek on the planet. That creek is right here in Jefferson County. It's called Turkey Creek. And some of you might have been up to Turkey Creek Nature Preserve. The college helps run Turkey Creek through the Southern Environmental Center. If you were to learn that the vermilion darter was now extinct, would you feel at least a little sense of disappointment, loss, or sadness? Record your answer. Okay, moving on. This is a young hatchling of a species of turtle called the Alabama red-bellied turtle. This turtle is found just on the Alabama and Mississippi coast, mostly in Alabama. It is endangered from human activities. If you were to learn that it had gone extinct, would you feel a sense of disappointment, loss, or sadness? All right, just a couple more here. All right, I think you know this guy. This is the African elephant. It also is endangered due to habitat loss and poaching for ivory. If you were to learn that the African elephant is now extinct, would you feel at least just a little sense of disappointment, loss, or sadness? Okay, here's the last question for you. This is another species of mussel. This is the highly endangered Alabama lamp mussel. Like all mussels, the lamp mussel helps clean river water of pollution, so it helps keep river ecosystems healthier. Mussels provide cleaner waters for recreation and drinking water extraction, both of which have economic value. If you were to learn that the Alabama lamp mussel is now extinct due to human causes, would you feel at least just a little sense of disappointment, loss, or sadness? Okay, so make sure you've got responses written down for all of these species, because I'm going to next show you the results of a previous class. Okay, so here are the results from a previous class. And what I want you to do is, in a moment here, hit the pause button on this video lecture, and I want you to compare and contrast the responses. And I want you to come up with some ideas on your own. If you got a study buddy you're watching this with at the same time, you guys can discuss this. But I want you to speculate on why there's differences between these species. So go ahead and pause the video, and then I will give you my interpretation. Okay, welcome back. So what I want to contrast here is that there's a pretty wide spread across some of these species. We had the highest level of yeses for the African elephant, and the lowest number for the Coosa moccasin shell up at the very top. Now, you might have noticed that the elephant probably has a higher level there because it's a more familiar species. You've seen elephants in picture books, on TV and movies and things like that, maybe in zoos and circuses, although that's finally getting out of practice. And those were Indian elephants anyway, in circuses and stuff. But anyway, the point is the elephant's a very familiar kind of iconic species for Africa, and one of the biggest of the megafauna left on the land surfaces of the planet. It's pretty familiar. So not surprisingly, the year that I asked this question, 9 out of 10 students said, yeah, it kind of sucked to some degree if the African elephant went extinct. A close second was the vermilion darter. That class may have already had seen the vermilion darter during one of our labs, but I think a lot of people sort of see a brightly colored, beautiful fish and learn about its connection with the college in Jefferson County here with near Birmingham and feel a little bit of connection with that species. Less so with the Alabama red-bellied turtle, and for reasons I don't fully understand because it's just as beautiful a species, yep, but it might be that there's not that Birmingham connection perhaps. But the really big contrast here, the one I think that is most informative, has to do with the invertebrates, the mussels, and the other species. We humans tend to value other species more if they've got eyes and they resemble us a little bit more. The less they resemble us, like a worm or some slime mold or something like that, the less people are just sort of like reactively going to care about those species. That mosquito that I swatted at earlier, I can't believe I missed it too. If that mosquito had big old googly eyes and looked up at me like, "Are you really going to smash me?" It would be a lot. I would certainly pause before I smashed it, if I even smashed it at all. Some people I know and live with in this house actually just brush them away and don't hit them. I'm not quite there yet. But anyway, psychological studies have compared our reactions to species and found that these, animals, especially mammals, we tend to value a lot more than other organisms and that sort of thing. But check out also, and this is the big one, this is the last comparison, check out the two mussel species. 48% for the Kusa moccasin shell up at the top versus 68% at the bottom. They're just mussels. They're just blobby mussels. You can just see the shell. The shells look basically the same. What's the difference between the times that I asked about those two species? Well, if we roll back a slide or two here, you'll notice with the Alabama lamp mussel, I told you a little bit about some of the ecosystem services that we get from that lamp mussel. It helps keep our waters cleaner, and that's good for recreation, and it's good for drinking water that we pull from our rivers. And taking that into account, there's a 20-point increase in how much people value a mussel. It went from 48% to 68% at the same level as one of our vertebrate species, the Alabama red-bellied turtle. What's the point with this? Well, that's the value of environmental education. That's the value of what I'm doing right now with you, is educating people about the value of biodiversity. And when people get woke to that, it changes how they see nature and how they see their relationship with nature. And the more of that happens, the better. And we need it as soon as possible for all these reasons that we've been talking about. Okay, so at the very beginning of this class, I posed this question: so what? Why save biodiversity? Let's start tying this up with some tight answers to that question. One that we've already talked about is that ecosystems provide more and better services when they are intact, having all their species and their populations are strong. And this has been very well supported by science over the last couple of decades. And the concept has been there's a nice set of metaphors to explain this concept, and I'm gonna use those metaphors here. Okay. First, let's look at the graph at the top right. This is on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. You got the number of species in an ecosystem. And on the y-axis, you get ecosystem functions. Think about ecosystem services. So in other words, what you see here is a positive relationship where the more species you have in an ecosystem, the higher degree of ecosystem services you get from that ecosystem. Okay, this has been found in ecosystems around the world. It's not a linear relationship. You see, it's curvilinear, and that beyond a certain point, the slope does start slowing down a little bit as you add new species. You don't get quite as much return for ecosystem services, but it's still strongly positive. And this is, like I said, it's been found in many studies across different types of ecosystems. Now, to understand the value of individual species to ecosystem services and ecosystem functions, we're going to use that metaphor of ecosystems being like a plane. You can imagine that jetliner down there at the bottom right, okay? And think of ecosystems like airplanes, and species are the rivets that hold the plane together. Now, I should have had a picture here of a rivet, but if you've ever seen a plane up close, you'll see like where the sheets of metal come together, there'll be these little round things that look like nail heads, but they're not nail heads, they're rivets. They kind of punch through the metal and then bind the sheets of metal together. So rivets basically hold the parts of the plane together, okay? No, or at least the fuselage, the housing of the plane. If you were to lose a couple of rivets off of a plane that large, it wouldn't be that big a deal. The plane would still fly. That would be analogous to losing a few species here and there, okay? But at some point, if you lose enough rivets, then something's going to go wrong. One of the engines might fall off, part of the tail or the wing might fall off, that sort of thing. And that illustrates that how important individual species are to ecosystem function and providing all those services that keep an ecosystem healthy and providing all those ecosystem services that we need. So the conclusion is that we need to keep ecosystems intact, meaning we need to keep them with all of their native species, and we need to keep the populations of those native species strong and healthy so that we avoid losing those services. So that was a hypothesis. The rivet hypothesis was proposed in the 80s by a team of biologists, a husband and wife team named the Ehrlichs. And it's been modified because the original ideas about the relationship between species and ecosystem services, they matured as more science was done. And about a decade later, Walker introduced the idea of the redundancy hypothesis. And he built on, so this was based on studies that were finding that multiple species in the ecosystem will do similar functions. So there's redundancy across species. I say and mean similar. They're not exact. You know, one bird might look very similar to the next species, but their role in the ecosystem is going to be a little bit different. Okay, and so, but it still illustrates that there's some redundancy. Okay. Now, what the metaphor that Walker came up with to explain this, he modified basically the rivet hypothesis, the rivet metaphor. And he said that he focused on ecosystem function and not just composition. So here's the analogy. He said that species are like passengers on the plane. So before, species were the rivets on the plane. Now we're saying that species are the passengers on the plane. And they use space on the plane and resources. So that's kind of like their niche, right? We learned about the niche, using the space and all the resources, etc. Okay, so species are like passengers on the plane using space and resources. But most species are not essential to the plane's airworthiness, whether or not it can fly or not, right? So I get on a plane and I fly somewhere back in the good old days before COVID. And that plane should be able to fly regardless of whether I'm on there or not, all right? That's the idea here. Now, many species can be passengers, and over long periods of time, decades to centuries or more, they come and go. They migrate into an area, they migrate out of an area, etc. Sometimes they go extinct. Sometimes new ones appear over long periods of time. And of course, there's that redundancy, as we talked about. However, there are some species in the ecosystem that are particularly important. Do you remember keystone species and ecosystem engineers? I used the gopher tortoise and the longleaf pine forest as our example of a keystone species, and I used the beaver as an example of the ecosystem engineer. Well, those guys are really important for those ecosystems, and those are analogous to the pilot and the co-pilot and the flight attendants. So these are species that have a particularly important role in that ecosystem. Okay? So all of this to illustrate that for an ecosystem to stick around and to be strong and healthy, there are some species that are really important, some that are moderately important, and some that are important but on a smaller scale. Those would be your passengers on the plane coming and going. So the conclusion from this, and again, this isn't just like theoretical like metaphor. This is what the science has backed up over many years of study. And so the conclusion here is that protecting the most important species in an ecosystem should be the highest priority, but the others should be protected as well to ensure ecosystem function, because redundancy is good and safe. The more redundancy you have in an ecosystem, the more likely the ecosystem's going to be fine if one species fails. Let's say one species gets a disease and disappears for a while, you got other species to pick up the slack. That's called resiliency. And the more redundancy you have, the more resilient your ecosystems are. And all this translates into good ecosystem services for us humans. Okay, moving on here. All right, so why save biodiversity? Let's kind of do a little bit of wrap up. We've got more to get to here in a few minutes, but a little bit of wrap up here to answer this question. We depend on biodiversity for our daily survival, for our food, for our clean air, for water, for medicines, and also our longer term survival with things like supporting services and regulatory services and so forth. Biodiversity maintains stability on Earth. Otherwise, we would not only wouldn't be able to survive here, but it would be like a crazy environment, everything changing all the time. So more reasons why we need biodiversity. Biodiversity enriches our culture and our lives. Let me try this real quick. So I'm out on my porch. It's September, so it's late in the summer, and you can see over in the background here, you can see all my little potted plants. I don't have a big yard, but I do have a porch space, and I've got flowers and tomatoes and basil and other things growing there. I love that. That's my little garden. That's been keeping me sane over the last few months, coming out here and nibbling on the basil and the tomatoes and things like that, right? I don't need that stuff, but it makes my life a little bit better. And that's what I mean by enriching our culture and our lives. And then finally, even the little hidden species, the ones that you never see, you might even step on from time to time or swat at if they're trying to bite you, that sort of thing. Those guys matter too. They're part of the fabric of our ecosystems, and healthy ecosystems have lots of them, lots of species in them, and healthy ecosystems mean healthy ecosystem services for us. So plenty of reasons why we should save biodiversity. Okay, I got a reading, or actually a video and a reading for you to do next. This is, I want you to go to the website for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Leave it to these international organizations to come up with these long-ass titles. But the IPBES, or IPBES, as they like to say, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but that's okay. I want you to go to their website and read this paragraph. I think I actually have all the paragraph pictured here, so I don't think you actually have to go to the website. So I want you to know who they are and what they're doing. And then I want you to go to Moodle and follow the link, or if you've downloaded the slides, you can click on the link here. Go to a 10-minute video that summarizes their very recent reports on the state of biodiversity and ecosystem services in the 4 major populated regions of the world. Okay, and I want you to be able to answer this set of questions by the time you're done watching the video. So be prepared to sort of pause the video, write down some notes, and make sure that you've got answers to these questions. We'll talk about these in class. Yeah, so go ahead and pause now and go do that reading and watch the video, and then be prepared to answer these questions in conversations in class. Okay, welcome back. One of the last things I want to talk about here are different environmental worldviews. This has to do with different ways people see the value of biodiversity. So let's take a look at this. This is straight out of your textbook. And what we see here are 3 different worldviews. They're arranged from left to right. On the left, you have more emphasis on instrumental valuation, so ecosystem services, okay? And on the far right, you have more emphasis on intrinsic valuation, meaning that species have their own right to exist. That is not the only difference between these different worldviews. That's just one of them. And so I want you to take some time to study these and read about them. And I want you to reflect on which of these is most in line with your own perspectives. Where do you come out here? Now I'm going to go through the next couple slides and talk a little bit about each one, but I do want you to be able to talk in your breakout group sessions with your classmates about like which of these views is most in alignment with your own. Okay, let's start with the environmental wisdom view. This includes a couple of different worldviews that are very similar, that might be described as life-centered or ecosystem-centered or earth-centered worldviews. Okay, and this would emphasize that humans are part of nature and that we are totally dependent on nature. An important distinction here is that we're not setting humans apart from nature. We're seeing us as part of the whole. We are part of nature. And that's certainly true from a science perspective in that we completely depend on nature. And certainly nature is being influenced by us. We're not in our own little isolated bubble by any means. It would go on to say that nature exists for all species. That's the intrinsic valuation, that other species have the right to exist. It would say that we should practice earth-sustaining forms of economic growth. That means that we can continue to have economic growth and continued spread of prosperity, but we need to do it in ways that is sustainable so that we don't overtax the planet as we're currently doing now. That's good for the planet, it's good for other species, and it's good for us because we want to be here a long time. We should be here tens of thousands, if not millions of years into the future. It would be a tragedy if we're not. That means, though, that we have to be very wise in the way that we use our resources. And then finally, we can achieve sustainability by studying how nature sustains itself. And that's certainly true. By understanding ecosystems, we can better figure out like how we can live in ecosystems and with ecosystems in order to get what we need, and for nature to get what it needs as well. All right, so let's now look at the other end of the continuum, the planetary management perspective. This puts humans at the center of the worldview, at the center of the universe. It puts more importance on humans than other species. So we're not just important because of the fact that there's so many of us and we're having such an impact on the planet, but simply because there's something special about us and we're super important and all that. And the planetary management's point of view is that we should really manage the Earth for our own benefit. In other words, we extract resources whenever and however we need, and as long as it's good for us, good for humanity, it's not a problem. If there's problems that it causes for other species, well, that's just too bad. Collateral damage. Other species are valued based on how valuable they are to us. So there's no intrinsic value here. It's simply other species are of value to us only if there's some way that they benefit us. So here you should be thinking about ecosystem services. What do they do for us? Okay. And then planetary management says that with technology and we should be able to manage the planet and actually redesign it and its life support systems to support us in our economy. In other words, we can continue to extract resources. Technology will continue to come up with ways that we can do that, and that economic growth is unlimited, and there's no point in trying to be sustainable about it. That's the planetary management perspective. And finally is the stewardship. This is the one that's in the middle. It's kind of a blend of the two. It's still human-centered like planetary management, but it also says that humans have an ethical, maybe you should say moral responsibility to be responsible managers or stewards of the earth. In other words, that it's okay for humans to be at the center of the universe and it's all about us, but we need to be good stewards, good managers of other species as well, and as best we can, make room for them. This also means that we should not deplete natural resources for future generations. We should recognize that other generations of humans will come along and need to use some of these resources that we are using up. Reading between the lines there, the stewardship perspective says that resources are limited and we can run out if we are not careful about our use of them. Okay, so those are the three perspectives. Be prepared to share with your classmates like what your views are, and we're going to have some discussion about that in class. Okay, that's a wrap. Lots to think about, lots to explore here, and so please be ready to come and share your thoughts on things about these issues when we come to class on, I guess it's on Wednesday. And I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.